Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, is mythology based in reality? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Heroes of Dawn Celtic Myth, or Heroes of the Dawn, actually. So this was actually a gift to me from my mom, of all people. And she got it because our ancestry is Scottish, and I go to great lengths to sort of celebrate that heritage. I wear kilts whenever appropriate. Any sort of gathering gets together, I'm going to be kilted up. And I care about the tradition that, really only, if we're being honest, was born around the 18th century because of the Victorians about Scottish culture. And so I try to carry that on my kids, and we go to, festivals and stuff like that. And just, I enjoy it. It's something that I'm connected to through ancestry, and it's something that I aesthetically enjoy, and it's just interesting to me. But what I was never into was Celtic mythology. I've never been a student of mythology at all, really. Like, I enjoy Abrahamic myths because I love the idea of, sort of heaven and hell and Satan and stuff. But outside of that, I couldn't give you all the names of Egyptian gods and goddesses, or Viking gods, or, Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. I have no idea. I could probably name 3 or 4 of them, and that's it. So I come into this going, well, thanks, Mom. That's a weird gift. She just saw it on a shelf at some rando store and she picked it up. And it's one of those sort of like Time Life coffee table books where it's really not thick at all. It's under 200 pages, and it's pretty large format, and it's just filled with photographs of historical artifacts and photographs of historical pictures, like the Book of Kells, for example, or different art that was, sort of painted on random surfaces and stuff. It's also, locations it gives really great photos of. And what I didn't realize, because when I think of Celtic mythology, or just Celts in general, I think of Irish and Scots, and that's kind of it. But the truth about the Celts, which I learned by reading this book, is that they are infinitely more diverse than that. And it goes all the way into Europe, all the way even to Asia Minor, back in like 500 BC, before Common Era, or before Christ, if you're into that. I don't know, time reference. But I find it very, very interesting that everything that I thought I knew about Celtic myths, if not was outright wrong, was just a tiny portion of a grander scale. And that's really what this book brought to life for me. So this was released by Time Life Education, January 1st, 1999. So it's actually pretty new on the stage of, historical books anyway. And it really centers around different aspects of the Celtic world: art, myth, and symbol, gods, goddesses, and cosmos, battles of the heroes, tales of magic and transformation, their sort of their legends and stuff. The legend of Arthur, which gets its own section because who doesn't love Arthurian legends? And then the legacy of the Celts. And what it really starts out early on in that first section of the Celtic world is that for nearly 500 years, the Celts had domination over all of Europe and most of Asia Minor. And again, that's something that, though I thought I was a student of history to some degree, I never knew that. And it was ultimately, of course, the Roman Empire that put the kibosh on the Celtic rule. And that's because the Celts, as a concept, I suppose, they were a culture. They were not a unified monolith. And this is another thing that I thought was really interesting. Because the Celts, as a culture, they all shared the very same sort of cultural identities. They loved very bright, vibrant colors and sort of mismatched colors. There where, of course, the tartan comes from. But again, the tartan was never really formalized until the 18th century anyway. When the Battle of Culloden, when the Scots were fighting against England, and Prince Bonnie Charlie came back from France to try to lead them to their revolution. And that just never really stuck because the English are are pretty tough bastards. They were in their imperial days anyway. So they love the bright colors. They love, the sort of the visual flair of it. And then their culture was one of violence. They were hedonists from top to bottom. So they loved to eat and drink when they weren't actively fighting. And if they didn't have someone to fight, like another tribe or another region to sort of conquer, then they would just fight amongst themselves. And this was like a regular occurrence. And we know this because all of the cultures that they warred through and conquered wrote about them. Namely, the Greco-Romans wrote a lot about them. And they were very impressed with their military prowess. I understand historically why, as through our general education and then my college education, why they focused rather than on the Celts, that they focused on the Romans, because again, they ultimately dominated the whole world and dominated the Celts. But before them, it was all Celts all day for 500 years. That's a long time for no one to tell you about them being in total control. And again, they were not a unified kingdom as such. They were a series of different tribes that shared a culture. And so when you think of world events, typically we think in terms of, well, France had its own little culture, and England had its own culture, and Germany had its own culture, and Italy, and so on and so forth. Even, Scandinavia. But the truth of the matter is that the Celts as a culture spread across all of those. And so there wasn't like this wall around different countries that prevented those different peoples from transferring between them and joining up in different tribes and breeding in different areas. And anyone who's ever studied any semblance of archaeology or just family ancestry can easily tell you that there is no descendant coming from one location and then going over to the US. It is very normal that multiple different types of people interbred, and that's where your family came from, of course, right? So you're going to have different nationalities and stuff. Well, that was the same with the culture, the Celtic culture. It was composed of many, many different nationalities that we would call nationalities nowadays, but they all shared the exact same cultures, which is a very strange thing as well. Because again, reflecting on history, we think that cultures are isolated to regions, but they're not. They became that way ultimately through imperialism, and that was all, your 13th, 14th century type kingdoms. But before that, before Common Era, before Christ era, it was just sort of whatever, whenever. There were not defined lines. Rome was really great about defining these lines. But before that, it really wasn't a big deal. So I learned all that through this book, which I found very, very interesting. None of the gods and goddesses really resonated in my mind, and I can't really reflect on them now. But what I did also find very, very poignant was that throughout all of that history, 500 years before Christ, and then hundreds of years after, BCE to AD, or CE for Common Era. Hey, Chris, how you doing? They never wrote anything down. Like their histories, they were never written down. So you have certain cultures that did focus on writing or runes or writing stories down, but the Celtic culture never did. It was dominated, its history was dominated by Druids. And so no matter where you were in all of Europe, all the way down through Asia Minor, that same culture, they had bands of Druids that would then retell the history orally through repetition and memory throughout all of these cultures. And so their whole system of their creation myths, their gods, their just regular culture, their funeral rites and everything was all completely unknown. And so as soon as the Roman Empire came, and ultimately what followed with the Roman Empire about 300 years later after the Council of Nicaea, and Emperor Constantine forced Christianity on every single person. So we're talking 800 years after the Celts had been dominating the world, the Christianity came through and wiped out all of the Druidic histories, and what they ended up rewriting as Celtic history was Christianized versions of it. Because there was no written record from Celts themselves, it was only Christians who were then rewriting the oral traditions that the Druids would tell them, and then they would change up all of the information to make it Christian oriented. Now, of course, this is nothing new. That's what Christians have always done throughout all of history, and it's one of the major reasons why I really am anti-Abrahamic religions, because rather than preserving the cultures of humans, they erase it. Just look at South America as a prime example. Look at North America as a prime example. Look at all of our ancient histories from, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and onward. Everything in history gets Christianized. It's not all bad, because then if it wasn't for the Christian culture, we wouldn't have written and printed word. It was the Bible that was the first printed Bible, or the first printed book. But it is important to note that one culture swallowed all other cultures and completely rewrote their histories. So everything that we know about them is through artifacts and trying to decipher between the lines of the Christian written words. And that's another thing that we always have to remember whenever we're reflecting on any type of history at all. It's filtered, not always for the best of intentions, usually for control and domination. And so, the idea of there being some empirical truth to history is idiocy and childlike thinking. Everything is filtered. Even nowadays, just look at our political system in America right now. Reality and facts completely depend on who is saying them. How depressing is that? But it's nothing new. It's always been that way. So maybe it's something we just need to accept as humans, for whatever that means. And so I love the idea that even something as simple as the legend of King Arthur, we reflect on the version of Legend of King Arthur that was written in the 17th century by Romanticists. You go back to the earliest versions of King Arthur, and they were written 1,000 years after the guy was supposed to have lived, if he was in fact a real historical figure. He was supposed to exist somewhere around 500-ish Common Era, after Christ's death, or, AD. And so if he lived in that era, that was Roman Empire times, and the versions of the Arthurian myths, which came from, again, a Catholic priest, a monk, he, of course, changed everything in order to have a very Christian meaning. But even stuff like the Holy Grail didn't come in until like 1,000 years after that. So what we find with the Arthurian myth is that it was written down originally as a history of Britannia, the UK as we see it now, but then that was taken as a sort of a drama of the era. So what people did back in the day is they would recount history and retell it in dramatic ways, in the same way that we do with streaming series or TV series or films. They did it with plays and short stories and oral stories. And so the Arthurian myth that was supposed to be historical got turned into romanticism, and it completely changed and altered into what we now finally understand it as today. But the genesis of it is wildly different. And I found this incredibly fascinating. The idea of Merlin as a magic user, sort of a magician, that's like 2,000 years AD is when that came about. The original version was he was just a teacher, a scholar, and he was just teaching Arthur basic, information of the era. And so now reflecting back on that, we're like, it's all mystical and magical. We like to think of a medieval life or Bronze Age life with this fantasy lens. And we skip over the parts that are really gruesome and painful and horrid. And we just sort of focus on the parts that we like, and then we heighten them with even more fantasy romanticism. So the whole idea of Lancelot and uh, uh, why can't I think of Arthur's queen's name right now? For some reason, it's blanking in my head, even though I really do love the mythology. Their whole tryst, they had this romantic relationship, was just one French version of the actual Arthurian tale. And there's a German version that originated the romantic side, but it was with Galahad, I think, not Lancelot. And so, depending regionally, who liked the story and rewrote it to suit the tastes of the era that it was rewritten in, that's what became popularized and then carried forward through history. Again, there's no truth to history. It's all bullshit and made up. That's Guinevere. Thank you, Chris. And that's what I love so much about history is that, I've always reflected on Celtic history and in the reality of my own family history. Like there are some legal, I'm sorry, not legal, literary, scholarly studied histories about my family's last name. And there's 3 very thick volumes written all about it. But when you go back to the sort of, after the Ice Age finally melted away from the Highlands of Scotland, where my people originated from, once you get back to that time, there's no longer facts. Everyone claims to be from Arthur's legacy. Everyone claims to have spiritual heroes and, have connections to these sort of tall tales and fables of heroes and heroines, rather than face the reality of, well, we actually don't have any information from that era about our genealogy or ancestry, so we're just going to make it up. And they just make up stories. That's just what Celtic people did. And so even nowadays, I can't get accurate information because it did not exist even then to get. So I just find all that stuff really, really fascinating. So cultures that rely on oral retelling is fascinating to you because it changes with every telling. There's a permanency to the written word that is critical in preserving historical accuracy. On the face of that, Chris, I totally agree with you. The reality is the written word is also filtered, so it's a version of the reality. So how many of these bombastic, clickbaity headlines 150 years from now are going to be seen as fact? It's written word. It must be true, even though they're made up as lies to get people to click on the articles. So it's stuff like that I like to think about a lot. I don't know. I guess I'm just a weirdo that way. Just coming to the terms that there is no truth in life is just all perception. My drill sergeant back when I was in the Army over 20 years ago used to tell me that perception is 9/10 of reality. So that means reality is only 1/10 fact based, and perception is 9/10 of what we understand. And though there's no empirical, science peer tested results of that, it is a concept that I feel resonates with the reality as I live my life. How people behave and how they speak and how they reflect on memories. Even friends of mine, like from before my military service, when I went back to them afterward, we have dramatically different memories of the exact same events. One great example of this is in the film Braveheart. Well, first of all, the film Braveheart was not historically accurate, but in it, the way they were sort of telling tales and the tales about William Wallace would spread from glen to glen through the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland, completely mythologized William Wallace. That's what we do. And so when you do find volumes like this, which try their best to give you all of the different historical accounts and try to not spin a new narrative, but present all of these different accounts as possible narratives, then we as the reader get to then understand it as we desire. Because there's no other way to do it. You have to either adopt one person's version or you have to synthesize all the versions into your own. And that's just the truth of history. So I really enjoyed this book for that aspect of it. It does give you a lot of really cool myth stories. The Celts were really into, sort of the underworld. They were really into focusing on being a part of the natural world. And this is something that really, really resonates with me actually as well. And it's buried within the Arthurian myth that the health of a king is reflected through the health of the land. Now, this could be seen as a sort of a spiritual connection, or it could just be seen as how well a king ruled an area equaled the prosperity of that area. Not necessarily a physical connection, but the way that they actually ruled benefited, so a benevolent leader, you would have a sort of prosperous nation. A cruel leader, you would have a pained nation. And they played with that conceptually as saying the health of the leader equals the health of the land. But I really love that connection because the way I see it, our human bodies are completely filled with bacteria. Our guts have more bacteria than all humans that have ever existed, actively living. Our state of health is a culmination of things from what we put into it, how we take care of it, and how the creatures that really make us up, that live within us, interact with us. It's this harmony of all aspects of it, right? So we are not just us, we are what is also within us, literally other beings, other creatures, bacteria, life itself. And so if we can distill life to that aspect, well, why not expand it? Because we are all just bacteria on the face of the earth. How we treat the earth then reflects back on how the earth is going to provide suitable life for us to exist on. And yes, there's the randomness of chaos. And yes, there are meteors that are going to fly out of the sky and destroy earth and natural disaster and et cetera, et cetera. But you can take care of your yard in your home and that will bring you joy. You can take care of the community you live in and that will bring you a sense of wellness or happiness. You can take care of the nation that you identify with, and so on and so forth. Just extrapolate it out. And so our sense of well-being and the wealth and health of the land is reflected everything from the way we act and interact collectively and individually, and how our bodies and the life within our bodies interacts with us. And so, yeah, very much real. The life of the land is reflected in the life of the person because we are all symbiotic. We are all working together. I mean, it doesn't have to be religious, but it is biology. It is reality, and whether that's 9/10 or the 1/10, it's one that I really appreciate the concept of. And this book really kind of brought that thought process out. I mean, it's something that I've always believed anyway, but it sort of nailed it home because if ancient peoples believe this way, I'm a big fan of human cultures, and like Graham Hancock is this really wonderful journalist who studies ancient history and ancient peoples and proposes hypotheses based on scientific evidence that he and other scientists discover. And the truth about the human experience is that it's infinitely older, proven through Göbekli Tepe more than anything else, than we could ever imagine it being. I mean, I'm talking like 30,000 years before the Ice Age, there was human culture, civilization. And our current view of history is saying that no, civilization didn't start until the Fertile Crescent with the Sumerians and Mesopotamians. And that's just historically inaccurate. We have evidence now through Göbekli Tepe that there was high culture, that there was artistic and agricultural cultures, societies way before the Ice Age, which again went way into like 30,000 years in our history. So at the very minimum, 12,000 years ago, there was active societies. So how long before that? My point of bringing all that up is because the written word or written histories are a recent thing, native peoples in Americas didn't write stuff down, in ancient cultures. Our own Celtic peoples in ancient history didn't write things down. I mean, you had regionally in Asia, there was like the Chinese and Japanese really great about writing stuff down, but that was culturally dependent. Not everyone did that. And so how many other human cultures who did not write anything down, so there would be no written record of their advancement in existence throughout ice ages, did we lose and we just simply don't know about? How often was human existence reset because of natural disasters? And our current understanding, tales like, um, um, why does my mind go blank whenever I'm on a roll here? Oh gosh, the original flood myth was taken from a Sumerian story that was okay, I can't remember right now. It'll come to me in a second. But anyway, the flood myth is a reflection on actual orally passed down myths of ancient human experiences. And it wasn't just one flood. Regionally, it happened in different times and different places. And so, we have all these fables that were passed down through oral transmission that speak of ancient cultures. How much of that is true? How much of it is fake? How much of it is changed through the retellings? I mean, the human experience is damned amazing. And when we reflect on our own histories and the knowledge that we have on our own histories, that's where we really get to see through the lens of history and realize that it is infinitely more vast than we understand it to be, and we will never fully understand it because it was not normal to write things down. And shit degrades. It completely just goes away with age and time. I mean, we're just sort of floating on a rock thinking we know history, and really we don't know shit. And I actually like that. I like that idea a lot. It humbles us. It sort of puts us in perspective. And I think that's what we need as a people, as a species. We need to be humbled. We're a little too bold and braggart and hyperbolic and greedy. And we need to be brought down a few notches, I think. I think we would be a better people if that were the case. Better to each other, better to the land, better to the other animals that inhabit this planet. You also think that the Great Library of Alexandria, also all the knowledge that was lost there. Oh my gosh, that's a perfect example of another culture coming in and completely devastating. In that particular case, if memory serves, Alexandria, was that lost in a war, or was that lost through natural disaster? I know when Napoleon went through Egypt, they defaced the Sphinx. They wrecked a bunch of temples. They just destroyed everything. Even in modern cultures, when ISIS went through Iraq, they completely destroyed some of the ancient Babylonian art intentionally to erase that culture from the planet. There is no more vile human crime than erasing another culture's art and history. That should be punishable by torture and death, if I had my way. It is horrible. I think it was also battles too. But yeah, you're right. I mean, all the way back to ancient Greece, people would travel to the Library of Alexandria, which had the repository for all human history that was, collected thus far. What of all the ancient knowledges, all of the stories, gone. Just because someone wanted to be a dick. Ugh. It's devastating. And then, of course, the Spanish did that to the, South America, and we Europeans did it to the native peoples of North America. And it's just something that we do as a people. We create as a human culture and we destroy. And I hate that aspect of it. I just hate it. So anyway, then it talks about sort of the legacy of the Celts and, the fact that Celtic culture is dying. No one speaks Celtic language anymore. No collective of people. Even if you go to Ireland and Scotland, their Gaelic languages, which vary a little bit from Irish to Scottish Gaelic, but Gaelic itself isn't really spoken very much by very many people. And that is a Celtic language. And then the Welsh, they're getting a resurgence with theirs. They're really starting to celebrate their old Celtic heritage, which I desperately appreciate. And they have amazing landscapes. Celtic countryside is the Welsh countryside is amazing. And so it's nice that there are regional pockets of people that are reaching back and reintroducing their newer generations to some of their oldest generational knowledges and trying to sort of recapture that and take ownership of it rather than just let it go the way of the dodo. I think that's the best way that we can be, sort of shepherds of our own history, is to, if we're not going to write it down with as much honesty and straightforwardness as possible, rather than putting it through our own perspective lenses, then teaching it to our children and making sure that they remember that there was people before them, that the ideas of a stupid phone or internet is something that is incredibly new, that we don't know how it interacts with our minds and our bodies as of yet. We're still learning that. And that there is an entire history of human beings, all of the history that we understand and even more that we don't understand, who have lived without artificial light, without any devices, without books. Their entertainment was staring up at the Milky Way galaxy that was vibrant above them. And it was sharing stories and heroic tales, whether they were true or not, or based partially in history or straight factual. They would retell these stories over and over and over again for entertainment. And it was our human connection that brought us close. And I know how that sounds, but our human connection nowadays is through digital means, and we're not close at all. The intimacy of proximity is what it means to be human, not simply talking to someone over a digital line or a phone or something. That's so important to our species development that we don't even celebrate, in some cases, actively do anymore. How many times can you look up in the night sky and actually see the Milky Way galaxy? If you live in a town or a city, you don't ever. If you live in the wilderness or, maybe suburbia, you might. But there's this residual glow of our artificial creation that has cut us off from what every one of our ancestors celebrated as fact and reality. The sky above was as important to their life as the ground below them. And that is lost in our human culture. And that's devastating. And that's why I make it such an important focus on getting out and getting to the mountains, getting to nature, teaching my kids to be out there, because that's what humanity is. What I'm doing right here is not. This is some weird techno evolution. And it's not the same. And you can understand that if you're sitting around a campfire. You can understand that if you're breaking bread. You can understand that if you're going on a walk or holding hands. It's totally different. And it's so much better. So much better. So anyway, that's what this book brought up for me. And again, it's just one of those really quick reads that under 200 pages is very history based and sort of mythology based, which is the point. So if you're not really into that, it might not be, the thing for you. But I am infinitely more than I thought I was after having read it. So I'm giving it 5 out of 5 evil eyes. I was surprised by this book with the knowledge that it presented. And it made me think. And you can't really ask for anything better in a book, in my opinion. So I would highly recommend, if you enjoy mythology, it doesn't have to be this particular one. Go pick up a book and read and think. And then get outside into nature and celebrate that connection, because that's what all of your ancestors did as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Chris, it was great to talk with you. I hope you all have a fantastic day. And always remember that evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there and be evil.